I'm going to very quickly give you kind of an overview of how this all came together and the background context. As you just heard, it's been now 24 years since the plan was put in place, and lots changed since that time. So we had a big task in front of us, and so I'm going to give you kind of the backdrop to set up the more specific talks later. So the core team, myself and Tom, Becky, and Jonathan Long, and Matt Riley. There are many others involved in I'll talk about the author, chapter author leads in a minute. So development of this science synthesis involved a lot of things, but we wanted to give some background and purpose and history to try to set some context for this whole thing. And then a little bit about the scope of this, because we were addressing the interests of Region 5 and Region 6, and so we had to really hone in on the kinds of questions they were interested in and the kinds of material we had access to that would address those questions. I'll also talk a little bit about the role of science in planning and this notion of highly influential science and the peer review process that we went through. Okay, why prepare such a thing? Well, as I mentioned, it's been 24 years since the plan amendment came out, the Northwest Forest Plan amendment. This is an enormous area, 24 million acres of federal land, and I can't think of another example of an area where planning and evaluation was done over such a large area. And there's so many different ecological and emphasized socioeconomic issues that are relevant to this region. So we were trying to set this up so that Region 5 and Region 6 would have a really sound foundation of science to move forward with any sort of plan revisions that they might be engaging in. So our purpose was, first and foremost, we wanted to get questions from the region. What were the issues they really wanted us to address? We built on the monitoring reports, which came out in 5 and 10-year increments and had a lot of really valuable information. And of course, we wanted to review the body of scientific literature, which was enormous over this last 24 years. And then importantly, we felt like it was important to have a full independent peer review of this document for many reasons. And then, of course, publish it, which has now happened. So what were the drivers of change? Well, you're all probably familiar with this. I mean, the northern spotted owl was front and center behind this, and sort of more broadly, the old forest decline, old growth forest. There was also big concern over anadromous fish and the National Forest Management Act, and the increasing interest in broader ecological goals. We're also involved very much in evaluating a diverse public and the values they have way beyond timber production. So we have three or four chapters really on sort of socioeconomic kinds of issues that we'll be covering later today. As I mentioned, 24 million acres of federal land, mostly Forest Service, but quite a bit of BLM and National Park Service land, covering a really broad geographic area. The plan itself had 7 major land allocations. As you can see, there were already some congressionally reserved areas, wilderness and the like, but the plan set up the so-called late successional reserves, quite a bit of that intended for spotted owls and to a lesser degree other species. And these other categories, so there was a lot of land use allocation that was formalized in the plan itself. So the scope and approach of our synthesis rests largely on the questions we got from Region 5 and Region 6. And we ended up having quite a few questions that we whittled down through a process of workshops and discussions with the regional staff, we ended up with a priority list of 72 questions that we tried to address. And those questions, we were sorting them because there's many questions that were asked that were really not science kinds of questions. They're more policy types of questions, or questions for which there's little or no scientific information. So we sorted those out and arrived at that list of 72 that were things we thought we could address. And we organized it, as you probably know, into these 12 chapters. The chapters 2 through 11 were sort of the individual themes that we really focused on. Chapter 12 is I urge you to definitely read chapter 12. I think some of the more insightful parts of this whole thing come out in the integration chapter. The source material was enormous. We set up a reference literature database. We enabled the public to add suggestions for literature. As I said, we used the 10 and 20-year monitoring reports, over 4,000 scientific citations that were considered during this synthesis. Most of this was peer-reviewed, although in some cases there's little to no peer-reviewed literature available, so we used other sources if we needed to. So, you know, science plays an enormous role now in the 2012 planning rule. For those of you not familiar with the new planning rule, it really calls out science in a number of places, and so all the more reason for having the science synthesis. And you could see from this diagram that on the far left, the science synthesis was step 0 in this process. It was to sort of build this foundation from which step 1 could begin, which is the assessment phase. So we've completed this on the far left. The science synthesis is now out. It's in both hard copy and online. I wanted to take a minute to talk about the notion of a highly influential scientific assessment. This is a term that is referenced in the Office of Management Budget Information Quality Bulletin for peer review. And that sounds a little arcane, but it's really an important notion for federal agencies to pay attention to. And when we began this effort, we saw that this product we were going to produce could very easily be considered highly influential. I have in quotes here from the bulletin, dissemination is novel, controversial, or precedent-setting, or has significant interagency interest. We felt that this would definitely meet that standard. So we began to treat this as highly influential science assessment, which triggered a bunch of steps that we would have to take that are listed very briefly here. What was important from this is that we would want to go through an independent peer review. And so we, in thinking about this, we decided that the ideal scenario would be to engage the Ecological Society of America. They have a program specifically set up to do peer review of documents like this. It's a service they provide as part of the scientific community. And so we engaged ESA to begin that process early on. The timeline for this whole effort, now that it's been completed, you can see we started drafting this back in 2016. We had initial public forum in December of 2016. We had the opportunity for the public to provide input to the peer review team, not to us, and that's the way this process is set up for highly influential science. So they provided feedback on the first draft to the peer review team, and the peer review team then decided what to do with that. We got their feedback from ESA, and by the way, they had about I think it was 32 scientists who were part of the peer review team, at least 3 reviewing each chapter. So the final science synthesis was posted just past June, and it's now in hard copy, and here we are today. So you'll hear more about this as we go through all the different presentations, but I want to add emphasis to the notion that this is not simply an ecological challenge. Much of the science we have is pretty solid in terms of what we know about the ecology of these systems. What's more tricky and more complex, perhaps, is the socio-ecological environment that we're working in and how we work with the public and interest groups in trying to implement science and planning. So you'll see that theme crop up numerous times as we go through the presentations. A number of key and new issues came out of this discussion, new relative to when the plan came out in 1994. Climate change, for example, was just sort of a notion at that time, not a lot of discussion about that. Of course, we know how that's changed in the last 24 years. Single species versus multi-species conservation is a really interesting and important issue, especially with relation to the spotted owl and some of the other focal species. Successional and disturbance dynamics has become a much larger body of science in the last 25 years. Our notion of the historical range of variability has been morphing over time, and what its relevance is to science and planning. The invasion of the barred owl, as most of you know, has become a really significant issue for the spotted owl. We're much more interested and engaged in landscape ecology and management than we were back then, transitioning from more stand level evaluation and management to a landscape view. Changes in workforce and agency capacity is enormous. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but the Forest Service has far fewer employees today than it did in 1994, and it's probably true for other agencies. Reduction in wood processing infrastructure has a big impact on our ability to do restoration. Set aside any notion of harvesting large trees, which is where we were 30 years ago. We still need wood processing to do management, wood processing infrastructure. The public's view on this is as wide as a Columbia River, or wider. We're dealing with a very diverse public with widely divergent public values, and that's going to be a real challenge as the regions move forward with planning. Ecosystem services is now a very viable consideration in terms of the outputs of national forest. And finally, there's a perceived distrust of land management agencies in general. Whether that's valid or not is not what I'm here to talk about, but that issue is out there, and that's a challenge to deal with. So going forward, there's trade-offs for managers they're going to have to consider. It's significant trade-offs with regard to how to thin forests, what it means to restore fire, how to manage the road systems, which are a really double-edged sword for these landscapes. Individual species versus ecological resilience, you'll hear that concept and discussion a lot. And we only have limited resources to deal with any of these issues, so that's going to be a definite constraint.